in the lab, key to understanding the epiregolith.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to present some research here that's been supported by the vortices survey node out of APL. So I guess the first question is, what is the epiregolith? This isn't a term that's been used very much, but it is a really useful term, and it was coined by Mendel and Noble back in 2010 in a nicely written LPSC abstract. And basically, it's the surface layer of lunar regolith that interacts with the space environment. So it's the outer regolith, the epiregolith. And the really interesting thing about the epiregolith is that this is what you are sensing with optical remote sensing methods. Um, in terms of a lot of the work that we do on Diviner in the mid-infrared, the epiregolith is really important because thermal gradients develop in the upper millimeter of the surface. And this is something that Tim Glotch touched on this morning. And the bulk effect here is that it dramatically affects the emission spectrum of surfaces that have this thermal gradient over ones that don't. So this is what's being shown here in this bottom right-hand plot from Donaldson Hanna 2012 is showing if you have an isothermal surface like an Earth-like or a Mars-like surface, you get an emissivity spectrum that looks like this. But if you put it into a more lunar-like environment, you get an emissivity spectrum that can be look something more like that. And basically what's happening is that you're getting a convolution of the emissivity spectrum and the Planck thermal emission as dependent on wavelength. The CF is a much more transparent region, so you're seeing deeper into the surface than you are at the Ristrolin bands. So if this is your thermal gradient in the Ristrolin bands, you might be seeing the top couple particles, whereas in the Krston's feature, you might be seeing down 5 or 6 particles, and those particles are warmer. The thermal gradient effect really hasn't been discussed too much for the other optical remote sensing techniques, but that's definitely something that should be studied more in the future. So this is primarily going to focus on the mid-infrared. And then why simulate lunar eclipses? That's kind of a funny thing to be studying as well. Well, we know through a lot of work that's been done, and especially with the eclipses been presented by Paul Hain the past couple of years, is that the thermal wave penetration depth is related to the duration of the thermal pulse. For the diurnal pulse, you get a penetration depth of a few tens of centimeters. For the eclipse, being much shorter, it's variable depending on the length of the eclipse, but it's generally a few centimeters. The pre-dawn diurnal temperatures and the deep eclipse temperatures can be combined with thermal models to give you really tight constraints on the thermal inertia of this bulk depth that you're sensing. So you get a different answer if you look at the diurnal diviner data than if you look at the eclipse diviner data, because there's different thermal inertias as a function of depth. And then during the eclipse, in addition to having this thermal pulse that's a variable length, you can also use the warming and cooling parts of the eclipse to study this part that's above here, the upper millimeter. And you do that by leveraging multispectral observations and that wavelength dependence on thermal emission I was just talking about. So the motivation for this lab study was the diviner eclipse observations. We reported at LPSC a few months ago that diviners saw wavelength depending heating immediately following the lunar eclipse in the orbit after the surface had warmed up. And this was really exciting because this is the first time we've really been bringing to bear diviner's multispectral nature to looking at spectral thermal emission like this, especially during the eclipse. So in review, diviner has 9 spectral channels. It has 3 channels near 8 microns. We typically use this for composition, and as Josh wants us to use it for maturity now also. And then there's 4 broader band channels that span the mid-infrared to the far infrared. And those are typically used for thermal inertia, rock abundance, and low temperatures. So this is what Diviner observed. This is just a piece of the data. This is across Mare and Morum, and the data was collected right to left. So these red tracks were the pre-eclipse data. You start entering the eclipse on this one that's kind of cyan going to darker blue. The deep eclipse track is the blue one, and then coming out of eclipse you have this kind of orangish one, and then you're basically back to normal data after that. And there's 2 hours between each of these tracks because that's the length of the LRO orbit. If you look at a profile across the middle section of Mare Humorum, you can see this in profile, starting with the pre-eclipse temperatures. You drop dramatically during the eclipse. The lowest temperatures measured here were around 175. then after eclipse you warm up again. What I really want you to notice here is that there's this kind of rainbow pattern before and after the eclipse. And this is what we see for all diviner measurements at this time of day. It was about 9:30 in the morning, and this is due to anisotropy caused by surface roughness, where you have a very consistent pattern of the temperatures being warmer at shorter wavelengths. And I know Josh is going to talk about this some more in the next talk, but just keep in mind that we normally have this spread here. This is typical data, and right after the eclipse, the several diviner channels, the 3 8-micron channels, and then the next 2 long-wave channels, channel 6, which is 13 to 23 microns, and channel 7, which is 26 to 41 microns, basically collapsed on top of each other, which is very unusual because you would expect there to be a high isothermal signal coming out of the eclipse because the rocks will be different temperature than the soil. To kind of pull this out a little bit more detail, these are a few plots here. Sorry, this is a little busy. On top here, this is a diviner, very simple calculated albedo, pre-eclipse, penumbral eclipse, umbral eclipse, post-eclipse, and then the second order post-eclipse. You can see you're just entering Mare Humorum here. Penumbral eclipse, things are starting to get dark. Umbral eclipse, things are very dark. Post-eclipse, it's back up to basically typical illumination, and then post-eclipse 2 is the same. In terms of diviner, when you have this anisothermality effect, it's going to move, these are channel differences, it'll move them up. So this is what you would typically expect for diurnal, and it's also the same in the post-eclipse 2. As you enter the penumbral eclipse, rocks are staying warmer than the background regolith, anisothermality is increasing. During the umbral eclipse, rocks are much warmer than the regolith, anisothermality is off the roof. And this post-eclipse frame, you still have quite a bit of anisothermality if you look at a long wavelength channel versus the 8-micron channels. But if you look at this 13 to 23 micron channel, there's essentially no observable anisothermality here. And what we think is happening is that the anisothermality is being dominated by extra thermal emission in those wavelengths because they're emitting from very shallow, very near the surface, and that's the first to heat up following the eclipse. So we wanted to try to simulate this in the eclipse environment, and we're very fortunate to have affiliations with the vortices that allow us to do this. We use the simulated lunar environment chamber at the University of Oxford. Neil Bowles manages this facility, and he's Survey COI, vortices COI. And this chamber has been talked about a number of meetings, is capable of simulating the lunar environment. In this case, we did a tweak on it where we actually used it to simulate the eclipse by creating a lunar environment and then turning off the lamp and measuring spectra at a relatively rapid clip. So this was the methodology for the test. Back at LPSC, we produced a very preliminary test that kind of gave us the parameters of what to do. We went back after LPSC and did a much more thorough methodology for the next step, and then we'll have another iteration after this. We looked at 2 Apollo soils, 15071, which is Mare sample, and 61141, which is a Highland sample. We controlled the sample cup to 2 different temperatures to look at that variable, and then we also looked at both the cooling off when the lamp went off, and then we also collected spectra when we turned the lamp back on, because this happened to be the really interesting aspect of the diviner observations. This is what a typical sample run looked like. We heat the sample to radiant equilibrium. This takes a few hours, cooled down the backshield, then collected a baseline spectrum, turned off the lamp, collected spectra for 20 minutes in 30-second increments, and then would do the opposite with the lamp back on. This was actually a fairly challenging measurement, trying to come up with a collection rate which allowed for the data to not be too noisy. For these spectra, we ended up ultimately collecting 20 samples for each spectrum, where typically we collect several hundred for the data we show. But at the same time, you want it to be as fast as possible so that you can observe the differences. And then also, in these measurements, the sample temperature goes from being much higher than ambient to lower than ambient. And if you use an FTR, you know that this can cause a problem in your calibration. So we developed a new calibration pipeline working with Paul Lucy. And we're still working on reducing the Highlands data. But I do have the Mare data to show today. So these are what the sample runs look like. This is a cooling run. So this is the initial condition is up here. This looks very similar to data that Carrie Downsell-Hannon has presented at various conferences related to 15071. You turn off the lamp, and almost instantly, within 3 minutes, the sample drops in temperature by 100 K, which is very, very rapid and indicates that this is a very highly insulating regolith, especially in the very, very top surface, which would be expected where you have something with very low density. And then after 3 or 4 minutes, it slows down dramatically, and then you're moving towards kind of an equilibrium. this at the cooldown, it actually was, when we stopped the experiment after 20 minutes, we didn't know at the time, but once we calibrated the data, it was still cooling down to about 1 Kelvin a minute. And so if you extrapolate that to the diviner measurements, it would reach the diviner temperatures in about 50 additional minutes, which is on the order of the length of the eclipse that was observed. There are some limitations to this experiment. The sample cup depth is only 2 millimeters, so we have to keep that in mind when we're interpreting the data. On the opposite side, on the warming up run, so now this is the starting point, is at the cold temperature. You turn the lamp on. Once again, you get this 100 K increase in temperature over a very short period, and then you rapidly decrease. After the 20 minutes, we weren't actually back at radiative equilibrium yet. You can tell that this point here is a little bit cooler than the point on the left. To just take a closer look at the spectral aspects of this, there's a line here which I drew at the CF in the radiative equilibrium sample. When you're cooling off, the CF moves to shorter wavelengths, the spectral contrast increases, and this is what you would assume if the CF is emitting from the deeper, warmer interior, and the Australian bands are emitting from the shallower, cooler exterior. And then on the opposite, I guess we should have expected this as well, but we didn't until we saw it in the diviner data. When you warm it up, all of your initial energy is being absorbed and emitted in the Australian bands, so you actually, the CF moves here, and then very gradually moves back to its native position, and the Australian band intensity then decreases as well as the CF intensity increases. So this is very different and definitely something that we can measure with diviner and also feed forward into spectral thermal models. To take a closer look at the spectra across the full spectral range here, I just pulled out 3 the measurements. So in this case, the dark blue is the initial conditions, and the dark red are the ultimate, or the end of the sample run conditions, and then the light blue is the in between. Just so you can see the difference between the cooling run, where the CF is greatly enhanced, the Restrelan bands depressed, and the warming run, where the CF is depressed and the Restrelan bands are enhanced. And then the last aspect is the sample cup temperatures. I mentioned this. We did 2 different temperatures, 283 K and 354 K. Basically, this just applied an offset to the data. We need to be a little bit careful about this because of our sample depth. And what we actually want to do in the future is calculate a thermal model for what we'd expect in the eclipse for the sample for the temperature to be at 2 millimeters beneath the surface, and then actively adjust the sample heater as the experiment goes on. And we also want to do longer time baseline. Instead of doing 20 minutes, there's no reason why we can't extend this to a couple hours at least. So future work, next round of laboratory experiments, shorter and longer thermal pulses. You can get information about different depths by changing the length of the thermal pulse, variable heating, and also looking at the effects of composition and maturity. We want to incorporate the thermophysical models, just like I was talking about. The cool down is dominated by the thermal inertia. We also want to incorporate spectral models to pull out what essentially the skin depth is, or the emitting depth as a function of wavelength is. And this could really help us with some of the compositional identifications coming from the lunar data, and then bring it back and validate it with the diviner eclipse data. So the first question that comes up is, well, how much relevant diviner data is there? So far, the October 2014 eclipse is really the only one that's relevant for this study, and this is partially because of the sample setup is limiting the incidence angle of the sun onto our sample. We have another one which will be a similar condition, but being afternoon instead of morning will allow some extra constraints for us to apply on this problem. And then there are no total lunar eclipses in 2016, so we'll have to wait until a hopeful extended science mission 3 to collect more data for this study. So in conclusions, I know we're running low on time, so I'll skip this. This is what I already said, but the kind of bottom line is that this study we want to incorporate into the vortices thermal model, Sherman, which is a multi-body thermal model, and we're taking a lot of lessons we've learned from the lunar thermal models, putting it into this multi-body model, and we'd also like to include this spectral thermal modeling because it could be really important, especially when you're pulling out thermal physical properties of small bodies using near-infrared data. This could really help with that. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
One question. When is the next eclipse opportunity?
Next eclipse opportunity is September 28th.